Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. Thanks for joining us today. I am Shane Spalding. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, and I'm here with a number of my colleagues that you'll meet today who have contributed to this great work. We're excited to have you join us for this discussion. We're going to share about our work as well as engage in a discussion with some guest panelists. So thanks so much for joining us. First, I want to go through a few housekeeping items. So this event is being recorded, and that recording will be posted to Urban's website, so you can share it around and go back to it later. If you want to hide captions or adjust settings, you can do that with the live transcription button that's at the bottom. The speaker biographies and slides are available online at urban.org. All participants are muted. You can type your questions or any comments in the Q&A box at any time. And then for those of you that are active on social media, you can engage with us online using #live@urban. And then finally, please complete the survey at the end of the event. We'd like to take your feedback to help make our events better. So before we get started, I wanted to just give a little background on this project and tell you where it started. Next slide. So this project is part of a bigger initiative called the Shared Prosperity Partnership, which is a collaboration between the Kresge Foundation, Brookings Institution, the Urban Institute, and Living Cities. It leverages the innovative work of leaders across the US to build more inclusive and sustainable economy. Today, we're going to be talking about two projects that are under this broader umbrella. And the first is going to be a new online feature with some information on clean energy jobs. And this work was developed by Molly Scott, who you'll hear from today, Judah Axelrod, and Haley D'Elia. We'll also be talking about a report that we'll be releasing tomorrow. This is a framework for collaborative action. And I just want to acknowledge my colleagues that have been engaged in this work. You'll hear from Joe Schilling today, but key contributors include Madeline Serwa, Amanda Briggs, and Jinsey Wilson. So a little more on the background for this project. So the impetus really was this large federal investment in climate resilient infrastructure at the federal level. So we had the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as BILL, which was signed in 2021 with an estimated investment of $1.2 trillion in the US infrastructure. We also had the Inflation Reduction Act signed in 2022, which is focused on reducing carbon emissions over the next decade. There's a third piece of federal legislation which we didn't really focus on in our work, and that's the Chips and Science Act, which was focused on chips manufacturing and semiconductor manufacturing. Next slide. So these pieces of legislation created a real opportunity. The legislation includes language on making sure that underserved communities can access opportunities and around the creation of good jobs. So there's this triple focus on climate, equity, and job quality. There's an anticipation of large amounts of jobs being created, although we don't know that much about how many. There's a wide variation in the estimates. And at the same time, projected retirements in some of the key industries that are expected to grow. And so all of this led us to ask some questions about what jobs would be created, who would be able to access them, and whether there was enough funding and capacity to prepare people for emerging jobs. One thing that was important to note is in the legislation, there was limited explicit funding for workforce development to prepare the workforce for these jobs. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Molly Scott, who's going to share some information on the clean energy sector and jobs being created and the types of people who hold these jobs. I'll turn it over to Molly.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be with you this morning. Next slide. As Shane mentioned, I want to give you sort of an overview of this new feature that we have on Urban's website, right? Next slide. As many of you know, with all of these dollars that are flowing down for Bill and IRA, a lot of communities are required to put together a plan for how they're going to ensure equity in workforce development and access to good jobs. But there is little or no data about which jobs we're talking about, if they're actually good jobs or not, and who's likely to be able to access these opportunities, right? So we're trying to fill a little bit this knowledge gap and give communities something to work for, some way to be thinking about these sorts of things. Next slide. So the new resource that is available now looks at a couple of different things. It starts out by just explaining which jobs we are talking about in 3 different clean energy sectors. It talks about the pathways to entry for those jobs. And then there's a close-up on equity challenges nationally and in 8 example cities. So I'm going to walk you through the feature and talk to you a little bit about the things that we see there. Just a second, I'm just going to bring it up. All right, can everyone see that? Hope so. Um, so one of the biggest challenges is just defining the jobs themselves, right? Because clean energy jobs could really mean anything from manufacturing jobs to construction jobs to solar jobs to energy efficiency jobs, just all jobs, right? And luckily, the National Center for ONET Development through the Department of Labor, actually many years ago, did some really interesting work looking at all of these different sort of sectors of the clean energy economy and detailing the occupations that lie within them that require increased or that will require increased demand, right, for the particular occupation, enhanced skills or training of some kind, or completely new and emerging occupations. And so we took a look at the jobs in those occupations for 3 sectors: energy efficiency, renewable energy generation, and green construction. And the first thing we did is we wanted to get some sense of their quality, right? Like, what kind of jobs are these at the end of the day? And we have kind of an innovative job quality index that we developed in partnership with the Gates Foundation here at the Urban Institute that looks at job quality across 11 different elements. That includes things like you would expect, like pay and benefits, but it also includes things about scheduling, autonomy on the job, health and safety, all of those things, right? Basically ranks occupations in terms of being above or below average on each of those elements and then sums them across. So there's a score from like 0 to 11. So the first thing we did was to look at the quality of the jobs within the occupations in those sectors to see what they might look like. And actually, it's pretty interesting, right? When you look at that first bar, that's what job quality looks like for all occupations, kind of evenly distributed between a high, medium, and low. You'll see that green construction jobs kind of look like the jobs in the general economy. There's a real similar distribution. But you see a much higher concentration of what we would think of as high quality jobs in energy efficiency and renewable energy generation. So it's going to matter a whole lot what particular kind of clean energy project is being executed in a community in terms of the expectations we can have about the quality of the jobs that will be involved. Next, we looked at sort of pathways into these jobs. And they're really different according to sector, right? So we looked at the share of jobs that typically require a 4-year degree at entry. And you'll see for those energy efficiency jobs that tend to be really high quality, they also have very large shares of jobs that require a 4-year degree, right? About 2/3 of the high quality jobs and upwards of 80% of the medium quality jobs, even in energy efficiency. And those jobs actually fall into 2 different categories. It's important to note. There are a lot of engineering and architecture type jobs, but there are also a lot of management jobs that may or may not require the same level of technical skill, engineering or architecture, but the people typically, when they're hired in with a 4-year degree. right? And there are questions about the best ways to impart the skills and competencies to do management, and whether that four-year degree is actually required or not. Next slide. Let's see. The other thing we see is that for the jobs that don't require four-year degrees, they actually tend to have very high union coverage, which is an interesting both challenge and opportunity. And these are the jobs that account for the largest share of medium and high quality opportunities in renewable energy generation and green construction. So that's sort of an overview of quality and the pathways to the jobs. And the next thing that we did was to go into 8 different local communities, as well as nationally, to look at who are the people who are currently working in these jobs, right? Or in jobs that are very similar to them and very similar occupations. Because those are the folks that are the most likely to be able to quickly access the kinds of opportunities that are being made available over the next several years, right? And it also gives sort of a sense of, where our equity challenges might lie. So if you click on this in the feature, you'll see that you can choose one of 8 different communities: Chicago, Detroit, Fresno, Memphis, Miami, Minneapolis, New Orleans, or Rochester, which all have very different demographics in many ways, or the nationwide fact sheet. So I'm just going to choose Chicago just as an example and kind of walk you through what's available there. But you please go back to the feature and browse through the different profiles for each of the communities and find one that might have similar demographics or be in a similar region to yours and might give you some clues about what the challenges in your local community might be. And each of the fact sheets sort of starts with a description of the dollars that are being allocated to this particular city for Bill and IRA funding, as well as just overall demographics of the place. And then each of the fact sheets features 3 different visuals for you. I'm looking at representation in clean energy jobs, right? And again, in energy efficiency, renewable energy, and green construction. The first figure always looks at disparities for women. In this particular case, you see women are underrepresented in the potential clean energy workforce and in high and medium quality jobs in those sectors. And then there are 2 different figures for communities of color for each of the fact sheets, and representing the 2 largest groups in each place, right? And for Chicago, it is Black people and Latin folks. We can see that the trends are a little different. That the challenges for representation are greater for Black people in Chicago. And then for Latin folks, they are actually better represented, and the challenges are more concentrated in particular sectors. Oh, I'm sorry, it skipped to another fact sheet through the navigation. Sorry about that. This is actually for another community. But you can play around with the fact sheets and scroll through them and see the different trends. Note that when the second largest community of color is smaller than 15%, we made a group for additional communities of color that group everyone together, which is not ideal, but we wanted to be able to have reliable estimates once you start crossing smaller groups with really detailed occupations, it gets harder and harder. So you'll see that in some of the communities as well, that we talk about additional communities of color in these instances. So if we could go back to the slide deck, I'd love to talk to just about the general punchlines from the equity analysis. So the first thing is that jobs and energy efficiency are the most challenging for women and people of color to access. Again, a lot of that is tied to educational requirements that might be in place, and also just sort of existing patterns of who works in those jobs, right? One of the most clear equity challenges is women. That's across all of the communities we looked at and nationally. Women are underrepresented in the potential clean energy workforce and in both high and medium quality jobs in those sectors. So those are things that communities will have to be really purposeful with. Black workers generally have an equitable access to clean energy jobs as well. particularly the high and medium quality ones. Although they tend to fare better in cities like Memphis and Minneapolis for some reason, where the challenges are most concentrated just in those energy efficiency jobs. Compared to Black workers, the national outlook for Latin workers is more positive. You can see that in cities like Miami, where Latin folks are the majority. They tend to be pretty well represented in clean energy occupations and pretty well represented in high and medium quality jobs. So the question there is whether making sure that that Latino folks can have good pathways into those occupations in those particular sectors. Um, and then, another big takeaway for all of this is that the solutions to the equity challenges are going to need to be customized depending on which jobs we're talking about, right? If we're talking about the engineering and architecture jobs, which are an important part actually in all three of the clean energy sectors, we have to talk about equity in STEM in our colleges and universities and the pathways into those degrees because they're going to be important. When we're talking about the management jobs, which are also very prevalent, high quality opportunities, we have to think about and work with employers on their job listings and the kinds of degrees that they're requiring and really figure out whether the four-year degree is required or there are other ways for people to learn the management skills and competencies and the technical things as well, the knowledge that's required to prepare people for those jobs through other kinds of pathways. And then the last part is that for those jobs that don't require four-year degrees and have high union coverage, it'll be really important to have unions as partners to, again, address existing inequities because, women and people of color are underrepresented in those occupations to begin with. And then really leveraging those relationships. And I know that Shane will be talking about some of the opportunities for apprenticeship and other things in partnership with labor. Just that lens that we want to make sure that we are also thinking about the stakeholders who needs to be involved in the solutions in different ways depending on the jobs that you're talking about. And just one other thing on that landing page, there's also a link to a database or an Excel spreadsheet that has all of the very specific occupations for all the sectors for folks who want to dig in the weeds and see more particulars about the jobs that we're talking about, quality and educational requirements. So with that, I will pass it off to Shane, who will talk a little bit more about the framework to ensure that we have equity and access to the good jobs in this space.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly. So we engaged in this work, and the real focus was on how cities and regions were preparing or could prepare for federal climate infrastructure investments to ensure that historically marginalized populations, including Blacks, Latinos, other people of color, and women, would have access to these emerging jobs and with an attention to job quality. So making sure that the jobs that they were accessing were of high quality. And so through this work, we developed a framework, which you see on your screen. We did this by reviewing the literature, looking at websites and the legislation itself. We conducted interviews with 26 individuals from national, regional, and local organizations, nonprofits, industry associations, local government, and intermediaries. And we developed this framework. And then we, after developing the draft framework, brought everyone back together for 2 roundtables, along with some other people working in this space to really inform the development of what you see in front of you. So what we heard about in our interviews was the need to better connect the climate infrastructure ecosystem. So that's what you see on the left-hand side. With the workforce development ecosystem. That's what you see on the right-hand side. So as we said, there wasn't explicit funding or there was limited explicit funding for workforce development in these 2 pieces of legislation that we're focusing on in the conversation today. And so the need to connect these two ecosystems at every level, federal, state, and local. We, through this work, developed a set of key principles to guide the work. So that's what you see in the middle. Identified the many different actors that need to be engaged in this work, and then a set of essential strategies and capacities. So I'm going to just talk through these quickly. I know you are all eager to hear from our panelists. Before getting to sort of the dimensions of the framework, I'll say that we had a number of different ideas about how the framework could be applied. So we imagined that it could be used in strategy development and design of policies and programs. For example, a state or local government starting an initiative focused on a particular sector. We also thought it could be used in policy and program implementation. So like implementation of these resources that are flowing down to the regional and local levels. And then in coalition building and collective action, we saw through our interviews really the need to bring together a wide range of stakeholders in this work. And so we hope the framework can help with that. And then finally, to influence further policy change and advocacy around the goals of equity and job quality. So quickly, the key principles we identified through our conversations with various people across the country. The first was prioritizing equity, which we define as the consistent, fair, and just and impartial treatment of all people, including those who belong to historically marginalized communities, such as people of color and women. The second was targeting quality jobs and pathways. So we know there's a history of economic development efforts not benefiting low-income communities and sometimes harming low-income communities and communities of color. And so we really wanted to focus on quality jobs so that the jobs being created here and promoted are not just any job, but trying to promote access to quality jobs. And then finally, the importance, as I said, of fostering cross-sector collaboration. And then we looked at the number of different actors that were involved in local efforts as we talked to people across the country. So policymakers and public sector agencies, nonprofits and community-based organizations providing social services or running workforce programs, the important role that education institutions play, as Molly mentioned, the importance of a 2-year degree or 4-year degree for some of these occupations, so importance of engaging those institutions, public and private employers, so this can include public utilities, for example, small businesses and large businesses that might be getting some of these federal infrastructure dollars. The importance of labor unions, Molly talked about that. A large number of these jobs are anticipated to be represented by unions. Intermediaries play a key role. Intermediaries can help to sort of facilitate the collaborative work of these key actors. And then philanthropies in providing critical funding to fill gaps and helping to drive strategy. Through this work, we identified a number of different strategies and capacities necessary to do this work. And I think the first is really important. It really relates to what Molly presented, but the importance of using data to guide strategy and ensure accountability. So this is about understanding what the jobs are they of high quality, and also what the needs are in the community. So how to make sure that resources that are flowing down are being targeted and benefiting underserved communities, and then using data for planning and goal setting, as well as measuring results. The second area is involving community in the design and implementation of solutions. So this is about involving community in understanding what the problems are and what the needs are. There's some language in the legislation around public engagement, so that's a critical element. Community-based organizations can be engaged for the purpose of promoting access to quality jobs. So we heard a lot about the importance of engaging community-based organizations that are working directly with low-income communities or communities of color to help promote access to these opportunities. And then finally, engaging community in the development of community benefit agreements. Community benefit agreements have been promoted as part of the Good Jobs Initiative, but they're also being spearheaded by several agencies as a part of this work. And so community benefit agreements, for those who don't know, are contracts between developers or employers and community to really spell out sort of what the benefits should be to the community as a result of these investments. The third area that we identify, the third strategy area, is aligning workforce development with equity, job quality, and local demand. So this is really about building off what we know about effective workforce development. So building partnerships with employers and with unions and community-based organizations, engaging in industry partnerships as a key strategy to drive this work, and then also providing necessary supports such as paid training. We learned about several examples of using registered apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship as a strategy to ensure that communities that people were working with would have access to these jobs. The fourth area is providing comprehensive technical assistance and expanding implementation capacity. So we heard from people that the anticipated money flowing down the pike, the need to engage the community through these public engagement efforts was like drinking from a fire hose. And so organizations expressed concern about the capacity they had to engage in these efforts, so that we identified the need to build nonprofit capacity and intermediary capacity, as well as to support small contractors, so minority and women-owned businesses, so that they can compete for funding. The fifth strategy area is engaging in advocacy and policy change. So within our interviews, we learned about efforts to collaboratively work to inform policy, inform the implementation of policy, advocate for shared funding, as well as advocate for accountability. This led us to some insights and ideas, some recommendations that came out of this work. And they came in two areas. We grouped them into two areas. One is thinking about the current IRA and IJA investments, and if there are ways to recalibrate these investments to make sure that there's this focus on job quality and equity. We know that there's been a lot of focus on community benefit agreements and on procurement, and we think that's really important. It's important to continue to support that work, not only from the federal level, but the state and local level, and to look for other ways that policy might be adjusted to be able to encourage access to quality jobs, as well as a focus on equity. We think there'll be an opportunity. There's really a big expansion in the use of community benefit agreements, but not that much known about what makes community benefits effective. And so there's a research opportunity here to really document what's effective, how can you make community benefits enforceable. That's one opportunity. Another area of need is to really try to strategically coordinate resources. We know that there wasn't targeted resources, at least required resources to be spent on workforce development. And so this is about bringing together resources, not only from the federal government and state government, but from philanthropy and from employers to be able to support the workforce development goals. We want to make sure we heard loud and clear in our roundtables the importance of accountability. So I think this partly is about just making visible what's happening with this funding and also what are the outcomes. There are some resources, some different websites that are tracking funding that's slowing down, but big questions about the outcomes of this funding. The second area is on building collaborative capacity. So this is not just about the short term, but over the long term, how can we continue to enhance the capacity of the system to be able to deploy these resources. So looking at enhanced technical assistance, opportunities for peer learning, and also making sure that the community is engaged and that there's support for community engagement. Finally, given the critical role that intermediaries play in this space, we have a recommendation on continuing to expand intermediary capacity. So with that, I am going to stop here and turn it back over to Joe, who's going to facilitate our panel.
Thank you, Shane. As you can tell from the research that Molly and Shane have completed, and that's still a work in progress as we try to connect more equitable career pathways to these unprecedented investments around climate and green energy. So we thought what we would do is get a better sense of those connections through this panel. So if I can have the panelists join me as I introduce them. We have Devin Hamilton, who's the program director at PowerCore in Philadelphia, where he's been there since 2017, working on the implementation of training programs for young adults and getting them into energy, green infrastructure, and youth development. We also have Gus Williams, the Climate and Workforce Development Advisor for the City of Seattle's Sustainability and Environment Office, where he plays a critical role in building out the city's climate and equitable economy and workforce policies. And then finally, Amanda Woodrum, who's co-director of Reimagine Appalachia, which is a 4-state coalition of diverse organizations and entities that are working together to develop a common vision and establish common ground to create really a more sustainable and equitable Appalachia. So thank you all for joining us today. So first question is just to help set the stage, which is, how does your organization really connect workers with these opportunities for climate infrastructure, green infrastructure jobs? And I'll pose that, maybe Devin, you start telling us how you and your organization work there in Philadelphia.
Hello, everyone. Devin Hamilton. And so I'll talk a little bit about PowerCore PHL. So we are a workforce development program in Philadelphia, and we engage out of school or out of work 18 to 30-year-olds in a 4 to 24-month program that connects people to living wage jobs and energy, green infrastructure, and community-based careers. We specifically recruit people who are most impacted by the city's gun violence and lack of opportunities. And so what we do is, we engage these young people, and we use our program to train them for jobs in the industry. So example of that is our Green Stormwater Infrastructure program that we run. So a Green GSI pathway connects people to jobs that could be accessed without a college degree. We started out in 2013 at the same time as the Green City Clean Waters Initiative, which is a 25-year plan for Philadelphia to build out our stormwater infrastructure. And we have developed an apprenticeship program where we're training people to directly fill the positions that have been created based on those plans. And so we have a direct pipeline using an apprenticeship approach and using AmeriCorps to connect these young people into jobs that don't require a college degree, and also are pathways to growth into larger, civil service positions.
Great. No, thanks so much. Gus, in Seattle, what does your organization or the office do there to help coordinate and connect workers?
All right. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to some folks. I'm here in Seattle. It's 9:35 a.m. So through this conversation, you might say good morning a little more. But that's just where I'm at, and my body's telling me it's morning time still versus being on the East Coast. But at the Office of Sustainability Environment, we're really focused on, shifting the priorities. So a few years ago, Seattle passed the Green New Deal, and this is going to be an overlay of this story I'm going to share a little bit. So the Green New Deal for Seattle really emphasized the reduction of pollution, promote economic opportunities, inclusive access to well-paying jobs, then also to advance our environmental justice by ensuring benefits and investments in clean energy transition. So with that being said, from the policy side of our house and the work we do came, our PET, which is our payroll expense tax. That PET, payroll expense tax, really put forth their initiative for us to have funding allocated to training programs. So currently, the city of Seattle has invested over $7.5 million in clean energy training programs out of this PET, which is the payroll expense tax. With that being said, we fund training programs from pre-apprenticeships that focus on construction for women only. We focus on solar training with a nonprofit in the Seattle region called Clear Solar. We also focus on the green construction side with the Northwest Carpenters Institute. And with all those entities that I named and called out, those entities provide direct access into the apprenticeship, into the labor unions. So that is how we're trying to find a way to shift policy, but also using a policy to create tax dollars to make sure those dollars are going to investments and training. So that is how we're really looking at the energy transition work, but also creating a space that, yes, we're not just reliant on federal funding, but how can we utilize our own policy locally to make sure that we have dollars available for training in our backyard.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. So yeah, the local policy and program and the tax is a complement to what's going or coming through the federal system. Amanda, Reimagine is a much broader aperture in terms of looking at these issues. But yeah, how do you all connect the sort of workforce and job dimensions to these climate investments?
Yeah, so Reimagine Appalachia is very broad, both geographically, but also in the sense that we're a broad-based and diverse coalition. So we are work across 4 states, which we refer to as the Ohio River Valley of Appalachia, but it's the Appalachian part of Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky. But for folks here coming out of the national arena, you might know us more as coal country. So that's a more common understanding. But we have worked really to get our place as a broad stakeholder coalition at the table of national climate conversations. And we wanted to make sure, as we were debating the federal climate infrastructure package, that coal country was really at the forefront of what people were thinking about. But we also recognize the need to bring together organized labor, racial justice, environment, faith, local government, sort of all speaking from the same unified voice. In order to get there, we had to come up with a common vision and have a lot of hard conversations about where the win-win-win is amongst all the different stakeholder groups. And now we're turning to the work of implementing the federal climate infrastructure package and pulling heavily from a lot of the things that have been lifted up in the research. And both Devin and Gus mentioned as really best practices coming out of the national movement for community benefit agreements and policies.
Okay, well, as they say, implementation on the ground, the devil is in the details. So now that there is resources and policy foundations trying to connect these equitable green jobs with some of the climate investments, yeah, what do you all see as some of both the challenges with these recent federal investments in terms of implementation, but also, are there some strategies that you all have put in place or that you're starting to see as a way to overcome some of those challenges? And Gus, I'm going to start with you in the middle, given you've got sort of the citywide perspective, is what you see as some of those challenges and maybe strategies to strengthen those connections with the workforce.
I think one of the challenges that we're seeing at a citywide level, and I'm sure this one goes across the nation as well too, is the availability to the fund. One of the areas that we're seeing is, the trickle down, right? To say it's not coming as rapidly as we're talking about training and development. One of the questions that folks are asking is, well, where are these jobs? When are they coming? Well, we know the research is all there. We know that the job numbers are on the uptick, but folks are not seeing the direct impact. And I think the catalyst to that is that, I love our union brothers and sisters here in the Northwest and across the country as well too. But I think some of that impact is we're not seeing the deployment of these projects, of these jobs, taking off right away. So there's a gap there. So we're hearing about clean energy transition. We're talking about the future of jobs, and we're talking about future workforce. But people are saying, when are these jobs coming to life? When are they coming to term? For example, in Washington State, we're awarded the hydrogen hub. We know that it's a future workforce, that it's a clean energy career pathway that is coming. But there's no funding there yet. But as we're trying to put forth a clean energy career or a hydrogen career workforce, there is some disconnect, there's some gaps there because, like, what are these jobs? When is it coming? And why are we training for it? So those are some of the challenges we're seeing. But in the meantime, the way to combat that is we're trying to find a way to get folks connected to the apprenticeships and the pre-apprenticeships right away so that they're upskilling, they're building their skill sets. So when these jobs are readily available, they can easily transition into these careers. So those are some of the two things we're seeing. And, we're seeing the implementation of funds and the project development. So once the two things, I think, connect, then we'll see a wild uptake in career mobility and advancements within the energy field.
No, that's interesting to see how the timing, the sequencing here is critical. And as you mentioned, don't wait until these jobs are finalized, but to really start with the apprenticeship, get those foundational skills now. How about you, Devin? What do you see as some of the challenges and where are some of the opportunities to overcome them?
Yeah, I want to second everything that Gus said. Definitely something that we're seeing as well. I think also too, just having all the stakeholders involved, like that, collaborating and working together to be able to implement these projects and making sure that the jobs are there and everyone kind of being aligned on the same page is something that I would want to see more of. And a lot of times that funding has to go through different entities in order to get to an organization like PowerCore. And so I want to be having be in the conversations and collaborating with local unions and the city and state, federal to make sure there's a plan in place to be able to create these jobs and really adequately train people to fill them.
Fantastic. Amanda, just of course, generally, what are some of the challenges, but also if you could speak to maybe the use of data to define good jobs, kind of building on Molly's presentation in terms of, how helpful that kind of that data set may be, and also, how Reimagine has been looking at that, kind of sometimes thorny issue is, okay, what is a good job when it comes to the energy sector or the water sector?
Well, I think what's particularly exciting right now, despite the fact that it takes a little time to work out, is that we are moving to a whole new economy. And that creates an opportunity to do things in a new way. I think most of the folks here are here because they recognize there's real flaws in the existing systems. And I speak of that broadly. There's flaws in the way we do economic development, and there's also flaws in the way we do workforce development. And the first and best practice is not doing those things in silos. And that's where these collaborations are important, having industry at the table, having labor at the table, but also having community at the table so that we're breaking down silos between these different groups. Industry can help us plan for what's coming. We know that a lot of these jobs aren't actually new jobs. They involve skills that a lot of folks already have. We're just sort of pivoting these skills towards new priorities, and we need to understand that better. Labor comes to the table with how to train a lot of those skills in, particularly in my work in the community benefit arena, working with racial justice leaders, Black leaders. Like a key priority for them really is access to these union apprenticeship programs, because this isn't about what one-time job they can learn. These folks can learn in apprenticeship deep foundational skills that build a career, not just a one job off.
Right.
And so but you have to build relationships between the racial justice leaders, the union leaders, and the industry leaders. And that takes work, and that takes trust building.
So I see Gus is nodding his head. So I don't know if you have a couple of follow-up ideas or observations, Gus, about how to build those collaborations and partnerships.
Amanda's absolutely correct. The collaborative effort, I think, has to be strengthened. That is bringing our unions, our industry partners, our academic folks, and community-based organizations all to the table. This idea of community assembly, roundtable, whatever else we call them in our world, right, has to become fruitful. And I think bringing all those entities to the table, we can really create that collaborative space and to address some of these challenges we're all facing.
Well, one question, I also see it in the chat, which is, as you alluded to, Amanda, you all, and many of the organizations and leaders that we talked with are a little bit ahead of the game. You're seeing the connections, you're forging these collaborations with unions and industry and community, the environmental justice organizations. But what do you do for, we'll just say the question in the chat was about unions. Like, okay, how do we bring a local, union to the table who hasn't quite seen all these connections yet and is still, we'll just say, doing business as usual, right? You mentioned we have to sort of change how we do economic development and workforce. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about how to bring unions up to speed with this transition.
I can take a stab, and I think that the Biden administration is really setting out the space for these conversations by essentially making it strings attached to federal climate infrastructure funds, right? Like, if you want these funds, then we want you to have both labor and racial justice folks at the table. And we want to see how your proposed plan, if in order to meet our scoring criteria for competitive grants, we want to see how you're going to make sure the jobs created are good union jobs, but also how you're building pathways out of poverty into those union jobs for Black workers, women, and people of color. And so it's out there, like the directive, but as we're learning, just having the money or having the director is just the first directive. It's just the first half of the job. There's a lot of work we need to do at the ground level to meet those needs and make sure that these goals actually happen in real time.
Devin, how about you? What experience have you had trying to work with employers, industry, union in order to get your Power Core folks involved and engaged?
Yes, it's very important to work with, employers, unions, and we work with them very closely. So a lot of our training tracks are co-designed with employers, and so that we are preparing people for the jobs that employers need, and they have some involvement and some voice in that. And so that's a really important factor to have that collaboration even before people get to the job, as far as the training and design of it, so that we're not building something that is no longer relevant to the industry.
Gus, anything to add?
And just to tag on to what my other panelists said, I think end of the day, it's bringing the unions on board, but also having a space for them to address some of those challenges or those fears that they may have. One of the things that we're looking at in Seattle, Washington State is, electrifying all of our buildings, right? But how do we make sure that we can connect with our local UA32, which is our plumbers and pipefitters steamfitters union, to talk about this electrician of all buildings, new buildings, and retrofit of these buildings in our city limits? So how do we bring them on board? Versus some electrification of everything and saying there's no more gas and oil. How do we talk about our waterways? How do we talk about, the water systems, right? That's another entity that our unions can partner on, and those are careers, those are jobs. So it's not like, diminishing their skill set or obsolete of the workforce, but how do we transition from, oil and gas to now focus on our water systems within our city limits so that we have clean drinking water? So there's all these other different areas, but I think it's understanding their fear and also understanding what the future holds, right? So that is how we can really engage our union folks and have those conversations. And in a policy world, many, many years ago, Seattle passed initiative called Priority Hire. So that initiative really held our contractors and union brothers and sisters, feet to the fire a little more to say, what, you have to get folks from these different zip codes in order to compete for these city jobs. So that is the CWA of the past, all those different things. So it really brought our unions to the table to say, in order for me to bid on these city projects, I need to make sure that I'm bringing folks from these particular zip codes who are normally underrepresented zip codes to take part in this workforce development, be part of these jobs that we're building for the city. So in a policy world, that is how you do it. But then in a community building aspect of it, it's like, how do you engage a union to say, this is what's going to happen to go forward?
Right. So there's a lot of complexity here listening to you all about the different, we'll just say, sectors, right? Because they may have slightly different unions or job specifications if you're focused on the water infrastructure compared to, we'll just say, clean energy. And yet, they may need electricians, or they may need other areas of expertise. But of course, the unions and the labor is only one actor. So I'm curious, as your organization, whether you play or there are other folks within your community who convene people, sort of take on this role as intermediary, trying to connect the workforce and the business and industry side and the workforce training folks, along with those organizations that are receiving or competing for these new climate infrastructure resources. So yeah, what about the role as an intermediary, and what kinds of activities have you all seen that intermediaries have played? I'm opening it up. Who feels?
I'll say, well, I think the key really is finding the win-win-win, which both Gus and Devin are sort of alluding to, is you have to create new job opportunities. So that's where the policy piece comes in. Then making sure that those jobs are, good union jobs. That's where, unions come in. There's going to be new opportunities here. And if there's new opportunities here, that means we have more room for new apprentices. And if you see the win-win-win, and we're increasing the number of openings for apprentices, we start to say there's a percent set aside for people from high poverty census tracts and disadvantaged communities. So you're creating the space like, here's this new opportunity. What's a priority for you? And you have that conversation with each of the major stakeholder groups. And then once they're sort of prefaced with this conversation and this opportunity, then you bring folks together and start to, okay, we heard from labor, this is what they want. We heard from the environmental community, this is what they want. We heard from racial justice leaders, this is what they want. And what's missing here, where are the tweaks we need to have. And then that becomes your sort of set of community benefit principles. These are our basic demands. These are what we want to see with
Right.
these investments.
No, that's interesting. So again, having this shared understanding, right? And I guess that's where data could help you about here's where the investments are, here's like where we think some of these jobs may be. But as you've all mentioned, you know, start at that apprentice level, get those skills, and then have a set of principles that everyone can get behind to then advance, is what I'm hearing, like from Gus, you know, at the city of Seattle, advance some policies and programs, or, you know, with Devin in Philadelphia, then that helps inform the work that you all are doing with PowerCore. Other aspects of collaboration that you feel are critical?
You know, I think one of them, and I have some colleagues here in this call, we have our labor council, which is, you know, our WDC, which is our Workforce Development Council, right? That is some folks in this call, I believe. So utilizing your Workforce Development Council across the board, whatever your city or whatever your county or government or state government calls them, utilize those aspects because they have access to all of their labor folks within a network. And I think they can be the biggest conveners, but sometimes I feel like we do not allocate or associate time with them because we're each dealing with our different bodies of work. But I definitely think, you know, the Workforce Development Council, whatever they're called in your region, engage with them in a meaningful way because they are the conveners and they are those sector intermediaries that have been doing this work for a while, and then also have access to federal dollars because they do support WIOA, they support all these different other initiatives that the federal government have laid out for many years. So I think convening those entities are key strategies to really move forward.
Mm-hmm. Devin, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what fellow panelists have been saying. In Philadelphia, I know like our local like commerce department or chamber of commerce have been key in like trying to build those relationships with local employers, and there's several like initiatives that are trying to bring together all the community-based organizations in the area and also employers to try to get that kind of conversation going. So I know there's definitely efforts that are happening now that is hitting on that, you know, trying to get people together in the same room to be on the same page.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, one last question for you all, which of what I call is the wish list question, right? Which is if you had like one thing that you could recommend, I mean, whether it's to federal, state, or local policymakers, when you see the work that you're doing and some of the barriers, like, oh, if we could only do this. And I know one recommendation and insight that we heard uniformly across the folks we talked with is the collaboration and the role of intermediaries. It's great work, but it does take resources, whether you're the intermediary convening or you're the environmental justice advocate who wants to participate, that there needs to be sort of dedicated resources for engagement, which I know sometimes is not as exciting as resources for an actual, you know, shovel-ready project. But as you all are talking, there needs to be some resources dedicated for that consensus building and developing those that shared understanding. But you may have some other things on your wish list. If you were talking to policymakers, what would you recommend that this would really help us strengthen the connection and make access more equitable for this emerging workforce? Amanda, you want to lead us off?
Sure. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. We have this huge opportunity to sort of transform the way we do economic development in this country and do it in a way that's more worker and community centered. I think we have a lot of the best practices that we can pull from on how to do development differently with the community benefit agreement movement, but actually doing the work on the ground to take full advantage of this opportunity requires building those deep relationships and trusted relationships between the different stakeholder groups, and that's hard work, and it takes resources, and it's not as sexy as putting a shovel in the ground. And so it's hard to find funding for that sort of really important but sort of wonky work.
Got it. Devin or Gus, what would be on your wish list?
I did jump in. So I would say, also thinking about the community, like a lot of people are dealing with barriers that prevent them from being able to even join workforce programs and things like that. So thinking about funding for like things like supporting people getting childcare, the supportive services, the case worker, the casework that needs to be done in order to run effective workforce development programs. I'll also say that, thinking about like long-term sustainable funding, so not just funding the project, but then how is the project, once it's completed, going to be maintained? Are those jobs? So when we're thinking about jobs, long-term jobs, once the project's completed, is there sustainable funding that's going to be used to, for maintenance and things like that, that could be, workers that are doing that. So those are two things that came to mind.
Right, Gus?
I'll just tap in here real quickly. One of the things that could be, a game changer to say is having access to a competitive RFP process, but also a non-competitive RFP process, where we're seeing that folks are needing technical assistance, different type of resources to allocate to their projects or to really get, their community-based organizations off the ground. So yes, as we know that not every entity is built the same. Some folks have the grant writers and all the data to support their work, their initiatives, but we're seeing that some smaller nonprofits or community-based organizations does not have those same allocated resources. So how do we have pool of funding, right? A competitive pool of funding and a non-competitive pool of funding to make sure that some of the smaller entities have access to these training dollars as well as the bigger entities as well. So those are some of the two things. Well, the one thing is non-competitive funding cycle, so people can get access to the funds to do the work that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that would hopefully level the playing field a lot better than what it currently is. So I'm gonna, well, first, let me thank you three for some great thoughts and insights, and again, looking at the work that you all are doing from these different scales is impressive and inspirational. But let me bring Molly back just to see if she has some observations or reflections based on what you heard, Molly, and then based on the work that you have done.
It's been really great to listen to all the panelists. You guys are doing such concrete work on the ground and have such a better sense of how all that is working. Appreciate you sharing those experiences. I think I just actually have a question for you. So most of the conversation has been about education and training as an on-ramp to equity in these kinds of jobs. I wonder if you could also speak a little bit to other ways of increasing equities in the sector, right? So we know that from work on racial crowding and other things, there are a lot of reasons why people who are even qualified are not necessarily accessing opportunities. I wonder what the conversations are like about what the role at these tables, right? These community tables, about what the role of employers is in the way they source talent, in the way they design their job descriptions, in the way they do their on-the-job training that's maybe not part of their apprenticeship for the entry-level jobs, right? How can we have a conversation about how we have equitable access much more broadly and not just in the education and training pathways to entry level? Thoughts on that? I would love to hear what you guys have been hearing in your local communities.
Go ahead, anyone. Just
So I'll start us off. I mean, I think at the end of the day, who gets hired is driven by the employers. And so if they make demands about, you know, if they mean building out a more diverse workforce, then they'll make it happen. And so we have to hold the employers accountable. I will say that I keep alluding to these best practices and community benefit agreements, but let me just like do a run through of what I'm talking about. And it can be replicated, as Gus suggested, at the local level. And I think we're going to see more and more of what Seattle is doing elsewhere. But at the end of the day, what is the win-win? We've got public funding for some sort of climate infrastructure project. So that's great for the environmental community, an important priority for them. But if we're going to build something, let's do it with green building standards. Two, green building standards just requires more skill, less cutting of corners. Like what we don't want, we're moving away from low bid contracting. That has what has gotten us in all the trouble we are in, because we know we get what we pay for, but we've somehow forgot it when it comes to how we use public funds. And so we want to make sure we're building quality, and that we're building with labor standards, good wages, benefits. And then we want paid on the job training opportunities for a percentage of work hours. So for instance, 25% of all work hours on all big publicly funded infrastructure projects should go to apprentices, registered apprentices or pre-apprentices, and that at least half of those work hours come from people from disadvantaged communities. So percent work hours set aside from high poverty census tracts or folks accessing public assistance like housing support or food assistance.
right. It's all connected together.
I could just add, I think in order for a lot of those things to happen with like equitable hiring practice, I think it has to be, policies and things like that as these projects are rolled out. Like I think there needs to be some type of accountability, some type, when we talked about data tracking, like are these things happening, clearly outlining what the expectations are and things like that. Because I don't know if employers are just going to do it on their own. I think there needs to be policies and things in place and then ways to using data to see the outcomes, to really see what's going on and if these things are happening.
Mm-hmm. And now's the time to start putting those policies in place, right? We're at that implementation stage. So I have a specific question for you, Gus, that just came through the chat, which is, where do you sit within the city of Seattle's org chart? And this person was saying they have a sustainability coordinator or director, but that person seems to be kind of buried within a department and doesn't do sort of the cross-departmental coordination that it sounds like, you've been involved with in Seattle.
That's a great question. So luckily for us at the city of Seattle, my office is the executive office of the mayor. So we're directed by the mayor to get work done, to say. So with that, we report, yes, our initiative roll up to his office, and in turn, those initiatives become executive orders, becomes policy, becomes whatever else we aim it to be. And that is how the work is done. So we're on the ground connected to our training institutions, our community-based organizations. We're connected to everyone on the ground. But we take our information back to the mayor's office because, we are executive office of his. And then we form and create those and shape those policies. So that is where we have that differential of work. But then also we're tasked to create these things called IDTs. They're interdepartmental teams. In those IDTs, we're able to come together as multiple departments to say, hey, what are your challenges? What struggles do you have that we can formulate and send up to the mayor's office, right? So to make sure that your work is visible even though it's coming through our office at OSE, which is Office of Sustainability Environment.
Mhm.
So hopefully I answered that question, but that is where I sit because we are executive office of the mayors.
Right, right. But even if there's not that office, the idea of this teams, interdepartmental teams gets it to what, Amanda had mentioned earlier, which is breaking down silos. So that's a really good strategy. So, oh yeah, go ahead.
I'd love to add this because I didn't really get to that, but there is you definitely want to build in accountability provisions into whether it's your community benefit agreement, policy, or plan. And one of my favorite approaches to this is the creation of a community benefit advisory board. And their whole purpose is making sure that the contractors are in fact meeting their goals. But with the idea, like, if they're not, let's have a conversation about what the problem is and can we help deal with it. But if they continually not meet their goals, then, they get crossed off the responsible contractor list.
Got it. So there are consequences and standards that you have to follow. That makes perfect sense. This probably is our last question, and there are so many good ones, but I'll combine a couple of them, which is one was asking about, are there things that you all are doing or some of your partners to help employers sort of reimagine their organizational culture so that it elevates inclusion, belonging, equity? And then someone also noted that specifically with unions that, their experience is that, yeah, unions are still some, in terms of looking at diverse membership, they're so slowly moving in that direction. But yeah, how do you get, I guess, in some ways, to change the mindset of employers and unions to having a more sort of diverse and inclusive workforce? Tough question to end on, but it seems like an important theme.
So from a city perspective, we look at policies. I mentioned our priority hire policy back in 2013 that allocate number of spaces and slots for people of color to get connected to these union jobs who are bidding for any city job over $5 million. That is one of the ways we try to combat that. Is it a true remedy? I doubt it. Can we be better? Of course, right? We now have Justice 40. We have all these different things. But that is one way, is to look at policy and say any jobs over $5 million city project, city led, we need X amount of folks, we need people from these different zip codes, all these different things. That is one way I would say. But like I said, it's not a true test. So how do we diversify our union workforce? And another component to that is, we have a contractor list. For example, we have a clean heat program in the city of Seattle. So that clean heat program just, takes folks who are on oil and gas to electric. So all of those HVAC companies, heating companies, sign a contract with the city to really look at our race and social justice initiative. So we look at, who are their leaders. We look at the diversity numbers. We look at all these things before they get put on that list, because we want to make sure that that contractor represents what our values are as a city. So those are some of the ways to try to combat it, right? But as city government, we cannot say we need to hire people of color, we need to hire women, we need to hire these folks, right? But we can say, hey, what are you doing? And does it align with our race and social justice initiative to now put you on that list? We cannot say prefer, we cannot say those things, right, as city employees and city government, but we can say you're aligning some of our values, right? And that is how you get to be a contractor in this network with other contractors.
Got it. Devin, how do you change these organizational cultures, which again, we know it's a long-term effort, but yeah, what do you think we can do in the short term?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Gus said. From on our level, as far as working individually with employers and unions, we're just trying to build those relationships and have, be able to be in a place where we could have some of those tougher conversations where we could give feedback on their culture, things like that, and that we're collaborating to make sure people are going in and they're getting the support they need when they get into the job, that we're still connecting with people, are still involved after people are placed in jobs. And so really trying to build that relationship with employers so that we can give them that feedback, as well as we taking the feedback on what we need to train them on. And then we're also giving them feedback on things like the culture and what people need to be successful and the supports that they need. But I still do think, like what Gus said, there still needs to be a policy piece to it that I think ultimately will be the thing that holds them accountable to that.
Right. And that policy, I mean, it sounds like Seattle there, so it's something local government can do. Amanda, you're advocating for policies across different states. It could be state policies. Well, we are at time. I sense that we could continue this conversation for at least another hour, but I know, there's a lot of work that you all still have to do in your respective organizations. So one, thank you so much on behalf of the Urban Institute. Let me remind the participants to please take the evaluation so we can get some feedback. And then I will close with this observation, looking at what I might call as the 4 or 5 Ps. So that this foundation that you all talked about earlier was getting principles, a shared understanding, and then from there, really that there's oftentimes processes that you're trying to, connect across different sectors and ecosystems, but that having, we'll just say, accountable policies or enforceable policies in place, whether that is, maybe this is another P with procurement is a potential pathway, but when you have these programs in place, it does sound like really the key ingredient is people, that you really have to build those trusts with labor and employers, as well as at the community level, in order to connect all these dots and get people on these pathways to more equitable green careers. So that's a lot of P's to end with, but again, thank you very much. We will be in touch to see how your work progresses. Thanks again.